It remains New Zealand's worst peacetime disaster. On the 28th of November 1979, a sightseeing aircraft carrying 257 people crashed head-on into the site of a volcano in Antarctica. Air New Zealand's flight Tango Echo 901 was designed to give passengers a unique and unforgettable sightseeing experience across the stunning snow-covered landscape of Antarctica. The non-stop 11-hour round trip offered passengers first-class luxury, accompanied by an experienced guide, who pointed out scenic features and landmarks over the aircraft's public address system, while passengers enjoyed a low-flying sweep of McMurdo Sound. For a cost of around $350 New Zealand dollars, passengers could enjoy a flight of a lifetime, safe in the knowledge that Air New Zealand had been operating these flights without incident since 1977. However, sadly, on the 28th of November 1979, that was about to change. At 8 a.m, Flight 901, a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, left Auckland International Airport. It was scheduled to arrive back there at 9 p.m. that evening after a brief stop to refuel and change crew at Christchurch. The pilots that day were Captain Jim Collins, First Officers Gregory Cassin and Graham Neville Lucas, and Flight Engineers Gordon Brooks and Nicholas Maloney. All were very experienced at flying DC-10s, although only Flight Engineer Brooks had flown to Antarctica before. The guide that day was supposed to be Sir Edmund Hillary, but he had to cancel due to other commitments, and his longtime friend and climbing companion, Peter Mulgrew, stood in. On board were 257 people, including 20 crew. As was usual, on the 9th of November 1979, 19 days before departure, two of the pilots attended a briefing in which they were given a copy of the flight plan, the same one used on previous flights. Before takeoff, the crew put the coordinates into the plane's computer, although they were unaware the coordinates had been modified earlier that morning to correct an error that had been flagged up from a previous flight. If they had checked the destination waypoint against a topographical map, they would have noticed the change, but it appears they did not. These new coordinates changed the flight plan to track 27 miles east of their original understanding and programmed the plane to overfly Mount Erebus, a 12,448-foot high volcano, instead of down McMurdo Sound. About 4 hours after a smooth takeoff, the flight was 42 miles away from McMurdo Station. The radio communications center there allowed the pilots to descend to 10,000 feet. Air safety regulations at the time did not allow flights to descend to lower than 6,000 feet, even in good weather, but it was obvious from Air New Zealand's marketing magazine that they had regularly operated below the permitted level, so passengers could get a better view. At around noon, the pilot, Captain Jim Collins, flew 2 large loops through the clouds to bring the plane down to about 2,000 feet and offer his passengers a look at the stunning scenery. As he assumed he was on the same flight path as previous flights over the vast McMurdo Sound, he wouldn't have foreseen any problems. Collins told McMurdo Station that he would be dropping to 2,000 feet, at which point he switched control of the aircraft to the autopilot. Visually, he wouldn't have realized he was heading straight towards Mount Erebus, because outside, a layer of clouds blended with the white snow-covered volcano formed a sector whiteout, a phenomenon that made no distinction between ground and sky, deceiving everyone on the flight deck. They believed that the white they saw ahead of them was the Ross Ice Shelf, a huge expanse of floating ice derived from the great ice sheets of Antarctica, but they were mistaken. The Ross Ice Shelf was actually behind the mountain that they should have been flying over. Whiteout was little understood, even by experienced polar pilots, and Air New Zealand had provided no training for the flight crew on the sector whiteout phenomenon. Consequently, the crew thought they were flying to McMurdo Sound, when they were actually flying over Lewis Bay in front of Mount Erebus. On board the DC-10, passengers were busy taking photographs or filming in the cabin and out of the windows. Many of these photos were later found in the wreckage and could still be developed, some of them taken seconds before the crash. Take a look. Unbeknown to them, they are all about to die. At 12:49 p.m, the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, began sounding a series of whoop whoop pull up alarms, warning that the plane was dangerously close to terrain. The cockpit voice recorder recorded the following: GPWS, pull up, flight engineer, 500 feet. GPWS, pull up, flight engineer, 400 feet. GPWS, pull up, pull up. Captain, go around power please. GPWS, pull. Sound of impact. End of recording. Seconds before the impact, the pilots tried to redirect the plane by using full go-around power, but it was too late. At 12:50 p.m, the plane crashed into the side of Mount Erebus and exploded, killing everyone on board instantly. McMurdo Station made several attempts to contact the flight after the crash and informed Air New Zealand headquarters in Auckland that communication with Flight Tango Echo 901 had been lost. What followed was chaos and confusion, and even the assumption that the plane had run out of fuel. At 6:05 p.m, family and friends were waiting at Christchurch Airport, where the flight was due to arrive and drop off 50 of its passengers. At this point, they were unaware that the plane had lost contact over 5 hours ago, and initially, airport staff informed them that a slight delay was not unusual, but as time passed, it became evident that something was amiss. At 9 p.m, approximately half an hour after the aircraft would have run out of fuel, Air New Zealand informed the press that it believed the aircraft to be lost. Rescue teams searched along the assumed flight path but found nothing, as they were searching in the wrong area. The wreckage was not discovered until 12:55 a.m. the following day, when the crew of a United States Navy aircraft spotted unidentified debris along the side of Mount Erebus. Unfortunately, there were no visible survivors. 20 hours after the crash, search parties arrived via helicopter and landed on the mountainside. They confirmed that the wreckage belonged to Flight 901, and tragically, all 237 passengers and 20 crew members had been killed. The vertical stabilizer section of the plane, with the Cruro logo clearly visible, was found in the snow. Despite Flight 901 crashing in one of the most isolated parts of the world, there was extensive evidence collected from the crash site. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were operational and could be deciphered. Additionally, there was extensive photographic and video footage from the moments leading up to the crash. As it was a sightseeing flight, many passengers had cameras, and most of the film could be developed. Identification of the bodies took several weeks and involved teams of pathologists, dentists, and police, led by Inspector Jim Morgan. The mortuary team meticulously recorded every detail to meet the coroner's requirements. As a result, 83% of the deceased passengers and crew were identified, sometimes using fingerprints or items like keys found in pockets. Many of the bodies were trapped under tons of fuselage and wings, and a huge physical effort was required to dig them out and remove them in freezing conditions, with the added hindrance of skua gulls trying to feed off the remains. But thanks to the team, all bodies and body parts were photographed in situ by the US Navy photographers and taken back to Auckland. However, tragically, the remains of 44 victims could not be individually identified. The accident report was compiled by New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale, and was released on the 12th of June 1980. It was established that at the time of the collision, the DC-10 was flying at an altitude of 1,465 feet. The investigation identified pilot error as the primary cause of the accident. Specifically, it was noted that Captain Collins decided to descend below the standard minimum altitude and continued to maintain that altitude despite the crew's uncertainty about the plane's position. They mistakenly assumed their route was the same as on prior flights, which passed over the ice and water in McMurdo Sound. In reality, they were headed over Ross Island and the 3,794-metre volcano, Mount Erebus. An additional contributing factor was a weather phenomenon known as whiteout, which likely played a significant role in the tragic outcome. This led the pilot to mistakenly believe that the white he was seeing through the cockpit window was the ice and snow on the water, rather than the peak of the mountain. While the investigation did clearly uncover the flight path discrepancy, it ultimately concluded that maintaining a higher altitude would have prevented the crash. The decision to place blame on the pilots was controversial, prompting a second investigation led by a Royal Commission of Inquiry, which is New Zealand's highest level of public inquest. The findings of this inquiry were drastically different. This time, the responsibility was placed solely on Air New Zealand. Although the plane had been flying well below the safe altitude, the inquiry discovered that Antarctic flights frequently operated at such dangerously low levels to provide better views for paying customers. The Royal Commission not only identified the airline's mistakes in the flight path as the cause of the incident, but it also accused Air New Zealand of attempting to cover up its accountability. This was described as a conspiracy to shift blame onto the pilots, which left the airline in a morally favourable position and minimised its financial responsibility towards the victims' relatives. Notably, the head of inquiry, Judge Peter Mahon, characterised the airline's defence as an orchestrated litany of lies. However, the airline fought back against Mr. Mahon's allegations by taking the case to an appeals court, where they ultimately won, and claims that New Zealand Airlines intentionally obscured the causes of the crash were dismissed. As a result, the Erebus tragedy remained unsolved, and the ongoing blame game overshadowed the grief of the victims' families, who just wanted answers. In the years that followed, the prevailing opinion is that the airline were responsible rather than the pilot team. Consequently, the airline ceased its Antarctic flights altogether, although one private airline now operates sightseeing tours from Australia. It wasn't until 2009 that Air New Zealand issued a first apology, although only for its behaviour in the aftermath, not for the actual accident itself. But on the 28th of November 2019, the 40th anniversary of the disaster, they went further when New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, along with the national government, issued a formal apology to the families of the victims. Ardern expressed regret on behalf of Air New Zealand for the accident and apologised on behalf of the airline, which failed in its duty of care to its passengers and staff. After the incident, all charter flights to Antarctica from New Zealand were halted, not resuming until 2013, when a chartered Boeing 747-400 from Qantas departed from Auckland for a sightseeing flight over the continent. To this day, most of the aircraft wreckage of Flight 901 remains at the site where it came to rest on the slopes of Mount Erebus. Its remote location and harsh weather conditions present significant challenges for any recovery operations. During colder months, the wreckage is covered by layers of snow and ice, but in warmer periods, when the snow melts, it becomes visible from the air, an eerie reminder of that terrible day in 1979 when a sightseeing trip turned into a disaster. The registration of the crashed aircraft, Zulu Kilo November Zulu Papa, has not been reissued. As always, our thoughts are with all the family and friends who lost loved ones. May they all rest in peace.